About 18 months ago, the progressive world was rocked when it came to light that a leading publicist named Trevor Fitzgibbon had been serially sexually harassing and mistreating female employees that led to the eventual shutdown of his corporation. More recently, a senior executive at the union SEIU, responsible for the Fight for 15 movement, has been suspended after multiple counts of sexual harassment of female staffers came to light. That executive, Scott Courtney, is currently under suspension while those allegations are being investigated. Here to talk to us now about the progressive movement and sexual harassment is Robyn Swirling. Robyn is the founder of a new group called Works in Progress, which addresses sexual and gender-based harassment in progressive spaces. And she joins us now from an airport. So we may occasionally hear boarding announcements as we speak with her. But first of all, Robyn, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Secondly, tell us a little bit about your new initiative, Works in Progress. What exactly is that?
Sure. So as you mentioned, about 18 months ago, we got this information came out about what was going on at Fitzgibbon Media, and it prompted, I think a good amount of conversations among folks, especially within the progressive movement, about, sort of what can be done. And every time one of these things comes out, people say, I'll do something, and it never quite results in any kind of systemic changes. And so after, having quite a few conversations with folks who had been affected, some folks who had worked at Fitzgibbon and elsewhere within the movement, came up with the idea for an organization that could really start to address this within progressive spaces specifically. So what Works in Progress is hopefully going to do, and this is still in development, that is create a certification program which would include trainings for existing staff as well as new staff as they come on. That would also include management. That would include board members and HR staff to the extent that they exist at our organizations and companies. It would also include an overhaul of policies so that we can make sure that we've got really strong policies on the books in our organizations which reflect our values. So as progressives, we generally speaking, agree about how people should be treated, and I think our policies around harassment should reflect those. So the idea would be to have policies sort of revamp and have model policies for folks to be able to adopt, which don't just, cover a company or organization's legal liability and protect them, but really protect our employees' well-being and safety. And then the third piece of it is implementing, some radical transparency within our organizations and making sure that everybody knows what it is that can happen. So who do you report to? What is going to happen if you report something that happened to you or that you witnessed? What are the possible range of consequences? And so all of this with the ultimate goal of creating a culture in which we talk about this more and we report this more and we get this out of the shadows and out of the whisper networks that people use to warn folks away from particularly, egregiously behaving individuals into something that is a systemic change that allows us to sort of keep everybody safe.
Well, I think, it's certainly a great idea. And I think just to put it in context a little bit, Robyn Swirling, I think progressive men in particular, a lot of them anyway, have been living in a kind of bubble where, the thought has been, we know about Hollywood and we know about maybe, a couple other businesses as well. Wall Street has a horrible reputation and so on. But progressive men, they're such good allies. They say all the right things about equality and empowerment and all that. But even, I think one of the things that we're finding out is even some of the progressive men who say great things about gender equality and so on, they can also turn out to be serial harassers. And I think for some people that's opened their eyes, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I don't think it should come as a shock to anybody that some people their actions don't match their words, right? Like that shouldn't come as terribly a surprise to most of us. Some people are jerks. It's what happens. I think that the progressive men who I think also think that a lot of the behaviors that they may be engaging in are harmless when they're not. So I think we see these cases like with Trevor Fitzgibbon or like with Harvey Weinstein or even Scott Courtney, where it seems so obvious. And there are these big behaviors and large-scale sexual harassment and even sexual assault. And that is not the sum total of what goes on in terms of what constitutes sexual and gender-based harassment. There are all kinds of inappropriate conversations that go on in workplaces all the time. If anybody who's listening has been on a political campaign, I am guessing they, should understand this. What I would like us to do is, eliminate some of those barriers that get people to understand that these big things are sexual harassment and not the everyday occurrences that we, really see more commonly within our offices. And I also just want to be really clear, this isn't solely a men versus women thing. Sexual and gender-based harassment is something that happens across all kinds of different identities. Cis folks and trans folks, queer folks of all stripes. There are all kinds of pieces of gender-based harassment as well. I'm thinking of, incidents where among even teams that are pretty much all cis women, people talking about pregnancy a whole lot in really inappropriate ways and asking folks, when are you planning to get pregnant? And how is that going to affect our team? In ways that are just super inappropriate. So it's not solely a progressive men think they're doing the right things when really lots of them are secretly sexually harassing and assaulting folks. This goes across the entire movement and anybody of any identity who is part of it.
Okay, that makes sense. And you've talked about HR policies and having the right ones in place. You've talked about, and strengthening them, of course, and communicating them. You've talked about training, which is very much obviously part of this. What are the parameters of what's appropriate to say, not appropriate to say, what to do if you see inappropriate behavior and that sort of thing. And then you've talked about radical transparency, and I want to talk for a second about what you mean by that.
Hey, RJ, I'm sorry, the question cut out right at the end there.
So what do we mean by radical transparency?
Got it. So yeah, what I mean about that is being really proactive and clear with everybody who works within a certain organization or company or campaign about what can happen. We know that one of the biggest barriers to people reporting is that they're really worried about affecting somebody's career, right? Women often don't report sexual harassment, we know, because they don't want to get the guy fired. If it's that kind of thing. And so being really clear with people about what are the range of consequences that somebody might face and how is the person who is reporting experiencing harassment or assault or any other, inappropriate behavior going to have a say in what happens. Obviously, companies have the final say in what any kinds of, consequences there would be, but being able to know that your voice is going to be taken into account as somebody who wants to make a complaint, I think is really valuable and important. And then there's also the fact that, the other kinds of barriers to reporting can be simply not knowing what the policies are, not knowing who you should be reporting to. So if we can be really clear about that, it's the kind of thing that helps us increase people's comfort with reporting and decrease these behaviors in the workplace overall. There was an EEOC task force on that was studying workplace harassment of all kinds And one of the things, that they found is that the least harassment occurs in places that are really proactive in telling people about what the policies are and about what the procedures are. The second most harassment occurs in places where there's a policy in place, but it's just kind of in a handbook that maybe you're handed on your first day and nobody ever goes over it with you. And then the most harassment occurs in places that don't have a policy on the books at all, or that people don't have access to know what the policy is. So by increasing our transparency and what people know about how their workplaces are going to handle harassment, we can sort of increase people's comfort with reporting.
So that all sounds great, Robyn, and let's say, for example, that a progressive organization has all of these policies in place, and the first complaint comes in. Let's say it's as you say, it doesn't necessarily have to be a man and a woman reporting, but let's say it is. Let's say the first complaint comes in about a man, just for the sake of simplicity.
Sure.
And the complaint is received by the organization. They may or may not have an HR department, or maybe HR is also the office manager, is also the IT person. Okay, the first complaint comes in. What happens then? Or what should happen then?
Right. So, complaints should be investigated. But people should be believed when they bring a complaint forward. I think that's one of the first steps, is just making sure that people feel supported in the fact that they have made that report. It's a really big step, and something that can make people feel even worse or feel like they've taken the wrong step is that the first response they get is to be told, like, oh, well, are you sure he meant it that way? Maybe you're overreacting, or, oh, well, you don't really want to interfere in this. Within the progressive movement, one of the big things that we see is people being told, subtly or even quite outright, that the work is more important. Mm-hmm. And, you're going to derail us from the really, really important work and our organizational missions if you report, or if you rock the boat, or if you make it publicly known that somebody is misbehaving, right? Your own personal comfort, it comes second to getting the work done. And so if we can be supportive of people right from the get-go when they make a report, that they are believed, that this is being taken seriously, that they care about the well-being of employees and their safety, and not just solely about the outcomes of the work, then that can go a long way. I think at that point, there's various paths that it can take depending on what the specifics of the complaint are, right? Sometimes you need to not be having to work with that person anymore, and whether that means that a person gets fired or gets reassigned, that is really at the discretion of the organization. And sort of the specific layout of teams.
So the last question I have for you, Robyn, because I know it's going to come up, I've heard people bring this up before and bring it up in the progressive space, is, well, what about due process? Or what about, does believing mean that you assume the charge is presented is true, and then does that mean the accused person doesn't get a chance to tell their side? Or, and I bring this up because it gets brought up constantly in these discussions. And what's your response to that?
Right. Well, I mean, for one thing, we're not in court, at least in this point in the complaint process. And so, the concerns about due process, I think, are a little bit different than when you're talking about in a workplace versus in a court of law. But aside from that, there's absolutely nothing that I'm talking about, or that I think anybody is talking about, that involves not letting the accused person tell their side of what happened. There's nothing about believing people when they make a complaint that says you have to believe them and then not perhaps change your perspective on it once all of the facts around something come to light. But that said, this isn't something people lie about, generally speaking. As with the arguments that are made around due process around, sexual assault cases more generally, or when we're talking about on campuses. The FBI and crime statistics and everything are quite clear that people don't really lie about this, or they do at a rate comparable to other, crimes and complaints. So, and that's, around 2 to 10%, somewhere within that range on sexual assault. Nobody is going to put themselves through a sexual harassment complaint process and the investigation and HR and the possible ramifications to their lives and their careers. Don't really believe that something happened. So I don't give a lot of weight to the questions and arguments around like, oh, well, what about due process? Because simply it's not a real issue. And I think it's used to distract and to try to continue to doubt on people who make these complaints and who speak up about being mistreated and sexual and gender-based harassment.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add to that is, unlike other forms of complaints that somebody's stealing or committed murder or what have you, if you're talking about due process, we don't live in a culture that says, well, it's okay to murder, and well, guys will murder sometimes because that's the way guys are, so
exactly.
So you don't have, what we're dealing with here is a cultural weight that we're trying to lift in order to make it safe and possible for people to bring these complaints forward. So, fair?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Okay, so this is all very important, and given what's happening in the news with SEIU, with Harvey Weinstein, with some of these other stories, and given the fact that I hope we're reaching a turning point toward greater understanding of these issues, all very timely as well. So Robyn Swirling, founder of Works in Progress, thanks for joining us and have a safe flight.
Thanks so much for having me. Take care.